A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Welcome, dear listeners, to Ethics in Video Games podcast. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that's so big, so bold, we had to have two guests to cover it all. It's a topic we've been waiting for, sex. We're going to chat about sexuality in games. So many questions have come to mind immediately, but before we dive in, let me thank and introduce our two guests. Zhia Zariko is a media and communications expat into game design and development. Originally studying written communications, she did an elective in games, aesthetics, and culture and never looked back. She now holds a master's on Let's Play videos from RMIT, Australia, and has been teaching game design and theory at a private college for 5 years. She is currently in pre-production for a narrative-driven game on romance, intimacy, and vulnerability in a dark fantasy universe. Fae Daunt is an Australian-born, English temporarily raised, Australian returned academic, researcher, and developer. Turning their experience in web into an endless curiosity for development and design, they have married their cultural experiences and academic knowledge into a sort of cosmic horror of curiosity. Faye wishes to further discussions of inclusivity, safe exploration, and understanding in games. Faye is currently developing an experimental mobile game that progresses in real-world time, which is an enlightening adventure in both horror and a growing understanding of why people have never done this before. So thank you all, and please welcome.
Lovely
Thank
to be
you so
here.
much.
Thank you.
So the first question, naturally, is we're talking about sexuality, and we're talking about it in the context of games. Are we talking about how the player encounters sexual situations or commits to sexual acts within a game? Or are we talking about something that's sort of bigger, relates to their sexuality outside of games?
We commute to work together because we work together, and we're sitting on the train and we're like, oh, what topics are really important to cover here? And every time we brought up a word, whether it be sexuality or consent, one of us would be talking about the character within the game. So we're like, character sexuality. And then the other one would be talking about the player themselves. And it would take us like a good 15 seconds to realize we're talking about two different topics entirely.
Right.
The reason why it's so complex is because in game theory, we are still trying to decide how to talk about the player external to the game, the player avatar representation in the game, the designed experience player, so the ideal player, the unintentional experience player, so the emergent player. So when you say player sexuality, academics immediately go, which player? And it really changes the answer to that question, which player you're talking about. So if you're talking about the person entering the game and that sexuality, that's one conversation. If you're talking about what the developers thought their player was going to be and thus wrote that player to be, that is a second conversation. And then you have kind of, depending on your theoretical basis, something called the magic circle, which is an existent state that only happens with the human and computer interaction, that it only exists there. So there's almost a third truth player that is unique to each person and each person's experience.
Right. We have talked about the magic circle quite a bit on this podcast. And so
Yeah.
when you so basically what you're saying is when you step into the game, you are taking on a persona, and that persona has their own sexuality.
Right. Potentially doesn't match your own or necessarily the character as written by the designer. Right. It's potentially a new experience. Cool. I love it.
And you could do that, and it could change every time you play the game too.
Right.
So let's talk about the possible problems that can come out of depicting sexuality in games. So we'll sort of focus on how sexuality and sex and gender, I guess, are all depicted in games. All right. So there's a classic way the player gets the girl by checking off different boxes, the things that she wants. So we're assuming, like so many people assume, that the gamers are male, 1835. We're already making these assumptions in the questions, right? But let's go with it. So let's just say there is a game in which you get a girl, and you have to do these things. You check off the box, and it's a super simple. What's the ethical issues with that?
One of the things that came up when we were discussing this previously is the idea that you kind of got twofold here. You have the implication of sex as a reward, right? You finished your quest, you get the sex, right? Like that's kind of how these games give that impression, and that creates a little bit of a problem culturally. Because, when you're looking at it from an anthropological situation, I probably didn't say that word right, because everyone playing the game is informed by the culture that surrounds them, you are adding to this kind of fog of culture that for some people will give them the wrong impression on how to act in a relationship, and for other people will be reinforcing their already dodgy ideas on how a relationship should happen.
Right. I mean, on its surface, it automatically makes the girl a reward, which is an objectification, straight up, right? This is not a person. This is a thing that you get. It's a trophy. And that's already problematic, right?
I want to add that obviously, we're assuming it's the girl. This is going back to the assumption about, the male heterosexual player. Is most of this about setting ideas about norms, right? About what it is that the norms should be. And I guess I want to add, and this is, I think, something you mentioned in I originally thought of this as sex, but I think when you guys wrote back to me, you said intimacy. And I thought that was a nice, broader category, right? It's not just that sex is the reward. Intimacy is the reward.
Well, part of that is that once you say sex is a reward, defining what you mean by sex that's another hour on the podcast already, right? Whereas intimacy already has that larger kind of thing. But the point that you raised there was very interesting about, like, usually it's the girl is the reward, because I do a lot of work within queer game sphere. Like at the moment, I'm organizing an exhibition in Sydney for Pride at Play to show off queer games for Mardi Gras. If you have in your game the kind of sex as a reward, finish the conversation, do the quest, get the girl, then 9 times out of 10, the reward will be a female presenting person. As soon as you have a game that has inclusivity and then tends to have, other options, the number of games that also kind of have that structure as it's a reward just drops significantly, right? And you see it as well when series age, they also kind of understand that a little bit better. Years ago, there was a huge kerfuffle about the early Witcher games, where it's you talk to a girl, now you get to have sex and you get a collectible card to show that you had sex with them. But then when you get to Witcher 3, there's still that element of reward kind of feeling, but the conversations and what you need to do to get to those are more realistic of human interaction. And ironically, if you just kind of hit the option that looks like this will lead me to good quest end, most of the time the love interests in that game will end up shunning you and you end up alone at the end, which I find very funny, especially if you really like Triss, because Triss does not care if you're just about that love interest.
So so you're thinking that as game developers sort of settle into their games, or maybe as they get older themselves, maybe this is a matter of the game developers getting older and more mature and having more mature thoughts about their game development, or maybe is it, do you think, pushback from the community?
It could just be the industry, growing, right? Over time, if you went back 20 years ago, games were, a pastime. They were just a thing kids played. There was complex narrative games out there, but not as many as there are now. So in a way, the industry growing up and seeing games as more than just a pastime, a place to tell a proper story, has given a lot of developers freedom to do it right and do it properly.
I want to ask about this idea of doing it right. By the way, for those who are listening and wondering what happened to my voice, I'm sick. But I'm determined to carry on. and not sit on the sidelines as much as I planned. But I am really curious, right? Because there's one idea of the, this intimacy as a reward, but then you have this, the other way you kind of mentioned it, which is, okay, you spend time with the person. The more time you spend with a character that is let's say, love or sex interest, right? The more, let's say, you raise the possibility of success, and then eventually you've crossed some sort of threshold, and there is success and intimacy occurs, and it seems to me that you're saying, well, now in past The Witcher 3, and let's say in more mature games, we do a better job at this, but that's really obscure, right? I mean, what does a better job mean here when the reality of how we build intimacy is a lot of times we have conversations, and there's something in those conversations that connects the two people. And what did the earlier games do wrong then that later games do right that is more realistic and more mature?
So there's an interesting thing that we need to cover here in terms of games with mechanical limitations. When you are essentially deciding a character is or is not romanceable, there will mechanically be a threshold you have to reach where you're able to tick a box that says, okay, you have done the prerequisites, you have ticked the boxes, this player is now romanceable, or you are now able to unlock intimacy, which is accurate for real people. Once you have ticked enough boxes, they will be intimate with you. What it isn't tackling is the idea that intimacy continues after the sex act, that you get to know them further, that there are different kinds of engagements that you can have with these characters. We've touched on this a little bit about how games are very masculine oriented, with a average audience age of 18 to 35. This is kind of despite the fact that statistics shows that 45% of gamers are women. And so what's happening is games are still being developed with that very heteronormative, cis masculine centric perspective of, this is what intimacy is. This is what we think people who like intimacy want, which is put in kindness coins until sex pops out. You have achieved the trophy. We do not need to go further than this, right? So more mature games are actually tackling this idea of, you're not romancing a trophy, you're romancing a person we want to feel like a living, breathing, organic person. People change their minds. People grow and evolve and adjust. And so how do we expect the player to at least acknowledge that? They don't have to navigate it, but they at least have to acknowledge it. So the conversation needs to continue after sex. The conversation needs to continue after the final box tick. The relationship needs to keep growing after you've achieved the trophy outcome. And that's the maturity aspect to it. I don't think we should relegate that to adult games only. It should be something that's explored, I think, in all games that have any kind of intrapersonal relationship, because it's a part of our everyday lives. How it's explored, that's up to the game. But I think it's something that the developers should at least be asking themselves, what are we showing in this moment? And is there a reason we're stopping where we are?
Right. It's occurred to me, and I agree fully with that. I think that we should be able to explore that in games that are meant for kids, because they should be seeing that in their own parents and their own families. So even if they're not seeing, the sexy times, they're still seeing intimacy of a different kind. But it occurred to me that for our listeners, we probably haven't said specifically, we're talking about player-controlled characters interacting with computer-controlled characters. So we're talking about the way that the computer-controlled characters are written and how they interact and how the interactions expand as they ought to, as you get to know these characters more.
One thing I did want to just quickly raise is that this is not a blanket thing for all games. There's not a set rule, right? And the two examples that come to mind is like Persona games. They always have this idea of relationships, of connections. They never have like physical intimacy, but through connecting to characters, you do get a emotional intimacy between the two. And bouncing off Zia's previous point, once you get to that point where you are now a partner to this character, one of the things that I think makes everyone sad when they play that game is that there is no change to their interactions after that point. You get to like date number 10 and you go, yes, we are boyfriend, girlfriend now. And then there's nothing about that in the story, and there's no more dates because you've just maxed out your intimacy thing. So you kind of lose that after the intimacy, right? And it doesn't need physical intimacy because it's not that kind of game.
I was going to say, this mirrors the kind of complaints that people have about, or some people have about marriage, right? You get to that point and then everything just stops.
This is the problem, the idea with a happily ever after kind of situation, right? Where you just have those ellipses at the end, right? If sex is the reward, let's say, the idea sometimes is that you've done it, so everything else is just kind of peripheral and the player would not be interested in the aftermath. And there's always an aftermath. Even if someone gets ghosted, or even if it turns out to be a one-night stand, but of course, if you see that if you see that character again in a game, how could that not feed back into the story in some way?
There's a wonderful example with Potionomics that I just want to very quickly mention. Not a complex game, not complex mechanics. It is almost at the you put in enough kindness coins and intimacy comes out, but it suits that game a lot better. And how it handles that last part is just the nicest thing, because when you turn up to talk to them, they look very pleased to see you. They're often got like a doting look on their face. It makes you feel like it still exists, right? You don't need a huge amount, but that's just a nice, sweet example.
Yeah.
I was talking to my class yesterday about this. And one of my students pointed out that one of the problems with the sex as reward model was how it dealt with consent, right? Which should lead us kind of as a segue to the whole consent issue. But the interesting part of the reward, on one hand, it seems to, respect consent, right? The person has certain things that they desire. You gave them the things that they desire, and now they desire you. They are satisfied and they want you, no problem. But one of the things that never seems to happen is consent is supposed to be essentially something, right, you can revoke at any time, right? And typically in a game where sex is a reward, once you've got the reward, you can go back to it again and again and again, as if it's a trophy you can look at again and again and again. I don't know how exactly you would program this so that consent can be reworked, but it looks at the limits, let's say, of this kind of simple model. So I wanted to use that to talk about like consent and why does it matter that games pay attention to consent? I mean, look, we're just talking about a bunch of pixels, right? I don't ask pixels to consent to me killing them in the game. Why do I need to ask consent for, to sexualize pixels?
So this is a very, very recently culturally relevant topic. So I want to tackle one thing in this question, and then we're going to move on to another one. The first one is you don't ask pixels consent for you to kill them in a game. They are usually trying to kill you back. So that is the way that they are demonstrating their lack of consent. There is a consequence. So that is the issue. There is also a really squeaky comparison for non-consensual intimate acts and non-consensual murder acts, because we as a society treat those acts very differently. The idea of murder being a crime and sexual assault being a crime these are treated very differently, which then leads into the most recently culturally relevant topic, which is a streamer was showed that he was watching AI-generated pornography with the faces of his real life friends on it. And a lot of the discussions in the Discord, in the Twitter, immediately skin crawling. But what was interesting to me was the discussions in the Twitter, which was, it's not real, they're just pixels. And so when you have this idea of it's just pixels, it doesn't need to consent, the conversation then is, why is that still okay? You know, if it doesn't need to consent, where do you draw that line? And if you aren't at least thinking about that, that is concerning, because where else is that conversation not being had in this person's life? When I was teaching game design, when I am teaching game design, sometimes in trimester 1 conversations pop up where things happen in games that the conversation around them doesn't exist. A good example of this was GTA 5. In one early try 1 class, some young men were joking about you could pay for sex with a prostitute, and then if you hit her after you paid her for sex, money would pop out, so you would get your money back. To which I then turned around and said, do you realize you just turned your character into a rapist? And they didn't process that. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to say there was a condition in which this NPC gave consent for this act. It is programmed in, and you have removed that consent. Therefore, this is now the consequence of your actions. And some people would turn around and say, but it's just pixels, it doesn't matter. But then that carries on to, how do you think about real sex workers? How do you think about real people that this digitized form is trying to represent? Can we explore really questionable things and issues in games? I would love to, but we're talking about a society where someone said E equals MC squared, and then they made a giant bomb.
I think there's a difference here if you're, again, talking about norms. And I don't know if I buy the theory of relativity turning into an atom bomb, an analogy.
I'm not saying it's a direct correlation. I was more trying to say, hey, Einstein came up with some good stuff, and then humans were like, what are the terrible things we could do with this genius work?
Right. But I mean, that might just show that we are, geniuses that can use technologies in lots of different ways. One way, I think, to draw a line, where you said, where do you draw a line? One simple way, I'm thinking of this person that used the AI to have to essentially model friends in porn. As where do you draw the line? You draw the line when it's for personal fantasy and has no social repercussions, right? So, and this is part of the question about fantasy, right? And what can be allowed for personal fantasy versus something that gets out in the world and could affect people. Obviously, releasing essentially something like that with the faces of people can cause them great harm. Using something like that for personal fantasy or curiosity does not. So, I mean, I'm wondering what you guys think about that potential kind of line.
Well, I think one of the big things here is that this is a person with a huge following, right? And there are a lot of people, the internet recently especially has done a huge job, a great job of suddenly giving people a huge audience without this kind of slow growth that in the past media personalities would have gathered over time, and they would have been able to acclimate to it. So you find people who are rocketed into, there are millions of people who pay attention to what they say. And unfortunately, with, as was once said in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And the fact that this information was shown, that someone that millions of people look up to went and did this act, will then make millions of people look at it and think, is this justified? Is this 100% an okay thing to do every time? And while that individual may have just looked at it as a fantasy, their personal internal thoughts on it and process and where they may draw the line doesn't get communicated. So you have a lot of very impressionable people who will see this and they will skew that information. And, online celebrities don't have to be perfect all the time. And for one, the fact that they were, apologetic immediately is a very good thing and should give points, but everyone's kind of going to have their own take about whether that apology is good enough or whatnot. But you will end up with people who see this and they will skew the message in their own way, and that makes it difficult. There is also the slight issue that, as they are a pretty famous person with millions of people following them, the data that sits within their computer is not always the safest. And so as soon as that information that they may have something like that they have, sitting around on their computer and whatnot, then there's always a chance that it just will go public anyway. And that's quite dangerous. Not saying that there is anything wrong with having personal fantasies, but this is a personal fantasy that is in a public space and reached the public and is no longer personal fantasy.
On the other hand, we do concern ourselves greatly with people who have other kinds of fantasies. People who have ideations of self-harm. That's something we like, oh, if you're having this, you should probably call help right now. These are things that we do concern ourselves with a great deal. On the other hand, we also know that, there is no correlation between violent video games and actual violence. So, like, how do we determine how much harm is being done?
I think this falls back to pull it back to video games and consent and sex and characters and things like that and players. I think this falls back to this idea of ethical responsibility, which is a philosophical thing, right? We can debate this back and forth. The issue that was taken up, as Faye mentioned just now, was the exposure to X amount of people. So video games, whilst they are fantasies, they are designed to be consumed by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of people, right? So the message that is being portrayed in any one video game at any point in time isn't a insular, do with what you will this information. It is formative. And, I try and tell my students this: no matter how well you design a game to only be consumed by adults, it will be consumed by someone too young and it will form their perspective of the world. And then you have these young adults, as actually usually men, who spend a lot of time in digital environments where this is a formative thing. This will help them shape their understanding, at least until something changes that or challenges that. It will help them shape their understanding of something, of war, of, power structures, of patriotism, of sex and intimacy. Are games required to challenge that or reinforce that or even engage with that? Required? No. But if you have this piece of entertainment media that can shape someone's world entirely, shapes their perception of other people, is there a way that you can reduce your impact on real people without losing something in the game? And the answer is usually yes. And it's usually a small, like a line, an indication. In terms of consent, like player consent, the game remake of Dead Space recently has actually allowed players to censor scenes of suicide. It just shows a little blurry image where you can't see it. That means that, and it doesn't affect anyone who doesn't want that censored. You could still walk in and see what's happening. But it means that this person who may have had a trauma recently in their life, or may have had something, a toxic relationship with suicidal ideation, and they're trying to work through it, can still enjoy this game without potentially being triggered. And one of the really interesting things when you include that in these kinds of games is actually the pushback. And to me, that shows that not considering consent, not considering people's traumas, not considering people's, wants and needs in life is normal to these people. The fact that the pushback exists shows that in this person's world, that is abnormal and indeed unwanted behavior in their fantasy escape and game space.
Right. But that's their fantasy, right? It may not be their world, but it's absolutely their fantasy world.
Yeah, but it doesn't affect the fact that sensitivity is shown to anyone else, even though it doesn't affect them. Someone playing on the easiest hard difficulty doesn't change your But the fact that it impinges upon their sense of validation means it is impacting them. Its existence impacts them. And so this, when we pulling again back to sex and consent and intimacy, the fact that the rejection of these things exists means that it is normal to these people to just not have it. And therefore the question then is, how is that approached in their everyday life if they can't even share this digital space that no one else is impacting them on?
Right. They don't want other people to have this space.
And they don't know why. It's not their fault, right? It's the fact that, have they been given the critical engagement skills? Have they had someone sit down with them and go, why is this so important to you? We live currently in this weird purgatory state with games. We're trying to move through games are for kids and games are for boys. Those kids and boys are now adults with views and values that they are pressing upon the next generation. Someone needs to sit down at some point and go, we never had a conversation when we moved into developing these games en masse. Is this okay? We never had that conversation. The conversation's starting now, right? But the fact that it has had so much pushback shows that there is an entrenched mentality of, it's get out of my games sort of thing.
I think that because the conversation is actually starting to happen, because I think a lot of people have been trying to have this conversation for a very long time.
Yes.
And so it's not for lack of trying on many people's parts that this conversation hasn't happened. That it is happening shows growth, as Faye, you were saying earlier, that this may be just the growth of the industry. The industry's growing up, which seems good.
I would say it's not just the growth; it's growth in relation to criticism. The criticism came. There was enough of it to start making a difference. But I want to take this and I want to kind of get more into the actual treatment of consent, specifically when it comes to sex in games, right? So, what are some of the things that maybe don't work so well when we're talking about consent with or modeling, let's say, consent with NPCs? How could games improve when it comes to modeling consent?
Interestingly, I think this is a trial and error thing. Like some games need to try something and then invite critique and invite, like, what do you think about this? How do you feel about this? And players will have very strong opinions because players are in their own journeys at different phases on those journeys. So where they are in that journey is going to change how they respond. And it's about being able to listen and being able to filter, like, what is highly emotional response but still valid and what is like someone who's maybe a bit further along. But I think how you tackle issues of consent going back to that is about going back to that is the character a living creature that has wants and needs and values, and how do you convey that even though they're digital, even though they're fictional, how do you convey that in a way that feels authentic as possible?
I actually wanted to bring up, because you raised an interesting point before, the idea of, I actually wanted to bring up, because you raised an interesting point before, Shlomo. It's the idea of some kind of, once any of these intimate acts between the characters leading up to it, there's often like some kind of there's never a visual or audible consent between the characters leading up to it. There's never a revoking consent. There's never a revoking kind of situation. A lot of countries culturally have put into in terms of consent and intimacy, the revoking at any time. A lot of countries have put into their educational systems the idea that the revoking at any time is an important thing to pay attention to. Something that is. I don't think that mechanics this needs to be like it would be something that is amazing, hugely built into mechanics of games as much as it would be absolutely amazing to see some intimate scenes in games like narratively. Just NPC revoked their consent and it was handled in a positive way, and like narratively. Just those examples so that people can see them would be fantastic. Then you find out why that was revoked provoked, you might find out
it's better for characterization
like
because then you find out
historically
why
what
that
may
was
have
provoked.
caused
You
them
might
to
find
back
out
off, and you
things
have
that
so
they
much
like or dislike,
space for
or
character
historically
growth just
what
based
may
off that
have
act
caused them
in a
to
really
back off. And
narratively built
you have so
game
much
that
space for character
it could
growth
be
just
used,
based
and
off
at the
that
moment,
act
it's
in a really
only used in
narratively
very
built
rare
game.
situations, but
just
I think it's
it
a really,
could be
really
used, and
important
at the
narrative
moment
to
it's
include in
only used
some
in
games
very, very
somewhere.
rare
Not all games,
situations.
just
But
some.
I agree. I mean, people get broken up with all the time.
I've never had a character in a game break up with me, and now I'm realizing that and realizing, oh no, there should be something like that.
We should we should
Right.
model
That's amazing.
the healthy ways to handle all these situations, right?
Yeah, there's been there's Mass Effect. The Mass Effect trilogy is actually has the most pertinent breakup examples in it. Unfairly disproportionately, the female romance options break up with them. There was one character who, in the duration of non-exposure was like, hey, I met someone else, I'm with her now, and you as Shepard are just like, I guess that's okay. Other characters are like, hey, you hooked up with someone in this period of time, I'm not okay with that, please pick one of us. That's handled in various ways.
That's really interesting. That was one of those things where I was like, I guess they're just going to be tolerant of me hooking up with everybody here, and that seems really bizarre because I'm obviously flirting with this person, and I was trying to get together with everybody.
Going in intimacy in games too, the BioWare is actually really good at having these moments in them where that rewards this, like, you've been intimate, here's some extra stuff. An example of this is people literally scoured the Dragon Age 2, I think, sound files for the distressed scream of your loved ones if you're downed in the game, and they're just on YouTube for people to watch. This is kind of what motivated my game, actually, was there were these people who just were hungry for more intimacy, not like sex. It was like romantic moments with your loved one. How do they show their love? What is their love language? If they get jealous, what does that look like? It wasn't that they wanted just good stuff. They just wanted everything.
They wanted that emotional connection to be put into the game.
Yes, a sort of an awkward parasocial relationship, but understanding it's a digital one, hopefully most people. And then in the course of like doing that research, even intimacy in games and romance in games, unless it's very specifically a queer-led game, is this is what a cis-het man thinks women want from romance in games. Or here is what the one female writer has been allowed to do in romance in games, right? So even when they're trying to create romance, it is still very almost patriarchally motivated. Do X amount of things, NPC's happy with you, maybe there's a bit of conflict, and then go. But there's never really any sit down of what is a relationship like in, a post-apocalyptic world where there's zombies? Or what does intimacy look like when you turn into a sword and, everyone's magically polyamorous? That's not a dig at Boyfriend Dungeon. That's me. Like, people wanted more from that game. They really wanted more from that game.
It was a fun game, but it is a pretty bizarre thing not to really dig into that whole... Yeah, that
and
whole
people
idea.
wanted more.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of, if people want more, why isn't anyone making more? Even dating sims are the epitome of fill the affection bar, give enough gifts, have as many conversations and pick the right options. Bam, you are magically in a relationship and the game ends. Right?
But
so
isn't that just the way that we understand that story? We have the story trope. We have this story that we tell about love stories. We have this love story, and the love story ends at that moment. That's when it ends.
I want to go back to the idea of consent, and especially to non-consensual sexual acts, right? So
Can I interject? Have we seen the opposite, where the player has found themselves in a non-consensual intimate?
Yes.
Yep.
And how do people react to that?
I have two examples off the top of my head. So the first example is there is a sequence in Outlast where the player character is sexually assaulted by a monster in first-person perspective. That is happening. There is no way to skip it. There's no way to get out of it. It's happening. Another one is fear 2, I think it was. Same thing. The male player character is the victim of sexual assault by a female monstrous character. No way to skip it, no way to get out of it. This was actually a really great discussion I had because it was a male victim and it was a female perpetrator. It is instantly treated.
In both cases, it's a male victim?
Male victim, female perpetrator. Bear in mind that from the face down, the female perpetrator, visually, aesthetically attractive body, right? It's treated kind of immaturely, which is that, hey, dudes like having sex. It's a monster. Just don't look above the chin, you know? And so I like, this is what I mean when we went back to like, when you said, the NPCs are not consenting to being murdered. We treat murder and we treat sex crimes, even though they're crimes, culturally, we treat them very differently. Literally only within the last, when was the 80s? 50 years? I don't know. Only within the last, 40 to 50 years have statistics included male victims of sexual assault, right? It's quite a recently accepted crime. And so when you're saying things like scenes of sexual non-consent, again, that back on what do we mean by player? Who is the player? What is happening? What is being engaged with? That itself is a really loaded discussion to have. Does it exist? Yes, usually in a horror situation, and usually the victim is male. When you have sexual non-consent with a female victim, it is usually a threat, and it is usually implied threat, and it is responded to very differently. An example of that is in the 2013 remake of Tomb Raider, there was going to be a scene that implied that Lara Croft had to toughen up and kill people or she was going to be sexually assaulted. It was in kind of like a trailer / gameplay reveal. And the backlash was huge because it implied that, for example, if you were sexually assaulted and didn't kill your perpetrator, you weren't strong enough as Lara Croft, In order for Lara Croft to be Lara Croft, she had to first be threatened with this act. And then when it came back to, no, she's just going to get murdered and or starved to death and or get eaten by bears if she doesn't learn how to do this. And there was no need for this violence. So this idea of sexual violence in games, sexual non-consent, in these two examples, when it's a male victim, is just horror, but only with a monstrous perpetrator so far. And then if it's a female victim, it is used as an incentivization to turn her into a killer, right?
One of the things that, to balance off that, so none of those games you mentioned were banned in Australia, right?
I thought sexual assault, depictions of sexual assault in games are not allowed in Australia, I thought.
Correct. Hotline Miami 2 was banned for a explicit rape scene, right? And that was near instant, whereas in other examples you have there, they're more likely to get into Australia, even though on paper what you are discussing is the same thing. And it is that, the Board of Classifications, for whatever reason, will see a scene of non-consent forced upon a male character differently, right? Like, even from a legal standpoint, where they're deciding if people are allowed to see this in the country. And that kind of heavily backs up that point that culturally people look at them differently.
So out of curiosity, so the Lara Croft case never actually happened, right? It was supposed to be potentially in there. And you brought up two cases of horror games where you have essentially a male victim. I mean, it is a horror game, but I'm still in both of those games. Was the context, the tone of everything, more about that this was horror and scary, or more in the sense of this was a personal violation and wrong in a different way than, let's say, it would be, the typical horror, let's say, is supposed to be wrong in a game, if you guys understand my question.
I distinctly remember playing through both of those scenes with no warning they were going to happen. This actually goes back, I think, to player consent as well, because I'm a female, I'm cis, I was playing through this and I immediately stopped the game because I was like, I am not okay with this happening. Like, what is happening right now? And so it was presented with horror, yes, but in such a, like, I had played, they're both at the end of the play, right? This is the reward of finishing the game, to have this sequence happen. And so I'm saying reward with, for those who are just listening and not watching, that's the end of the game, right? And so for completing the game, for finishing the game, for going through the whole game, this is the sequence that happens. In Fear 2, that is actually the end of the game. That player dies at the end of that. I'm pretty sure, I think. That his game ends and then he appears in a later game and he's crazy or something. But it was that thing of, I had no warning this was going to happen. The player, had no warning this was going to happen. I had played through the horror game very uncomfortably, but I had played it through, and then I had been shown this experience, and it wasn't it was a different kind of horror. And again, this is let's talk about art horror for the next 3 hours, shall we? But it was this idea of, okay, this is a place in which, I don't know, there's a monster lady ghost who's following me, and there's people hanging from the ceiling, and for some reason I'm a buff, silent, shoot everything dude. Or I, for some reason, am in the middle of nowhere looking for, I can't remember even who I was looking for at Outlast 2, but I was like, I would have picked a direction and just walked, right? So the situation is, I myself would never have normally been there, so this is why I'm okay with this horror experience. But then the sexual act happened, and it didn't matter who I was. It didn't matter who I was playing as. It was, this is too real. I didn't have warning. Even if it was like there was this depiction in the game, didn't have warning, didn't know it was going to come up. And it was, my response as a woman was so visceral. I had a almost mental breakdown as a result of it. And what hurt me more wasn't that it happened. It was, this is not okay because it's a male victim. Like, this is not okay. And so it can be presented in the horror aspect.
Do you think that's essentially what the designers were thinking? We can get away with this because it is a male protagonist?
I don't want to presume, but the fact that has been depicted in that way and it hasn't had the backlash, if that's what they thought, they were correct. And that is awful, right?
In popular media, right, there's tons of movies, TV shows with non-consensual sex, right, where that's part of the narrative, and it's done in a whole variety of ways. It's extraordinarily rare in games to see anything like that. First of all, I guess the question is why, and the second would be if games are to explore more themes of non-consensual sex, how can they do that in a way that is, that is moral, that essentially does what it should do?
So first thing there, why isn't there as many? Personally, I think it's kind of related to the fact that when you're playing as a character in a game, there's the theory of embodiment. Your empathy towards that character is so much more than if you were watching someone on screen because of the way that the mechanics and interactions, there's a whole thing about it. So there is a lot more of a embodiment within the game, which sometimes makes things more real. I don't think that means we should shy away from it. But it is very important that people who will have a terrible reaction to it know in advance that they're getting themselves into it. And I think this actually comes to a really, really interesting question, which I don't have a complete answer for, which is about warnings, right? Because as an example, so I'm going to start at the point of, if someone does not want to see a non-consensual scene, the worst reason why is because they have trauma associated with it, and those people should be 100%, protected from having to deal with that. And because that is a near horror experience, the kind of thing that I'd like to bring up there is, strangely, Doki Doki Literature Club, the horror game, which part of the reason it hit so hard with so many people, and often with scenes of, violence or horror, it hits so hard, is because it takes people aback, and there's a bit of a shock value there, right? And that shock value is built into, that portrayal as a whole, and lessening that kind of lessens the hit of it. But we also want to make sure people are prepared, right? There were people who played Doki Doki Literature Club who had mental health conditions that meant that they had trouble separating reality with fantasy, who were hit really hard by the way that game, went through its paces. But if you had immediately come up at the start and said, hey, everybody, this looks like a happy romance game, but it's going to get really, really scary, and people are going to pretend that they're real, but it's actually a game, in a way, you would have muted that experience, but you still have to have that conversation. So I feel like it's not so much a problem with non-consent being shown in games, because it is something that should exist and we should explore in moral ways. But we really need to look at, as a industry as a whole, how we warn people about these things. Like, we need a system in place that kind of sits on that border of giving people a slight warning about the direction things might be going, with the ability to look up details if that is an area that is a problem for them. So that people who glance at that and go, I have no problems with anything in that area, I will continue and it will give me a nice surprise, still get their surprise. But people who are like, wait, that's a problem for me, I'm going to double check for more information, can still check more information. And that's a really difficult line to walk, especially, as was mentioned before, people throwing tantrums about the fact that Dead Space would warn you when a horror scene came up. It would be like, it's going to get real spooky scary, are you going to be okay? And this wasn't even on by default, this was off by default, and you had to go into the settings and turn it on, and yet people threw tantrums that others were being warned. Right? And as a culture, we have to make sure that those things are there for people who need them.
We actually did an episode about content warnings that talked about Doki Doki, and especially the suicide. I think that they had there. But one thing that I was thinking about in relation to how TV does this is TV is episodic, right? So you get your warning right at the beginning of an episode. And it strikes me how it's hard to do that with a game. Right? So it's a game, right? You would get the beginning of the game, and then you could say at some point in the game, but you don't want to reveal too much.
We do have our ESRB ratings that will tell you on the box, hey, there's going to be some sexual content in this.
Right, but they're not going to specify in this context. And
in 123 hours, be aware. Yeah.
Right. And this is, it's an interesting kind of challenge of how you would do that. But I wanna kind of move on to this idea about, so far we've really talked about dealing with NPCs, right? So everything has been NPCs. What about sex and consent and intimacy when it comes to games involving actual, more than one human being? You're interacting with real people.
Yep. Okay.
I'm gonna move out of this.
Okay. I was involved in a big research thing about, strangely enough, the heel sluts movement that took place in Overwatch. The whole BDSM kink community around the act of healing as a submissive one and tanking as a dominant one, which is a big online space that involves a lot of consent. I've also done a lot of research into VR chat and the adult community there as well. And it's incredibly interesting because games by default do not have many systems built into them, because games that have this kind of interaction, usually it's not explicit, right? like Overwatch was never built for two people to enjoy a BDSM, relationship through. VR chat was never built as a online hookup and ERP system.
Can you explain that to me?
Which one?
The Overwatch BDSM thing. Overwatch and BDSM. How is that? How does BDSM fit into Overwatch? How does that work?
It's weirdly a extension of the cultural idea of the boyfriend-girlfriend dynamic when playing video games, where the boyfriend is the clunky melee fighter and the girlfriend is the healer who's following by and helping him do his heroic things and whatnot. That has then expanded into a BDSM kind of situation where that is service. That healing is a submissive service that they are then doing to. It's expanded a lot since then. There's reverse roles where you have tank sluts and power healers, and yeah, it's a whole thing I could go into, but we'll go into it another time maybe. But what I wanted to bring up is actual games, right? So, for example, you have VR chat, and very famously, there was a incident in the metaverse when it first launched, right? Where they're not built in order to have romantic or sexual interactions, but of course, because it's an embodiment of these people, they then go ahead and try to. There was a very, very popular story that went around where I think it was a journalist jumped into the metaverse and was virtually sexually assaulted within 10 minutes of logging on, because someone can just go up to you, reach out a hand, there you go. So you have interesting things like VR chat and metaverse, both build in personal bubbles, where when someone gets within that bubble, by default their avatar gets deactivated from your vision. So that's it. This is your safety bubble. There's a lot of games that built in basically a nope out emergency shutdown kind of thing, where it'll turn off people around you or mute people around you. But consent between players in a romantic situation is almost never handled by the company that builds it. It's handled by the player base. Things like that heel slut community, things like the 9 very big VR chat romance and sex communities, they have to build their own consent code, right? And they will, research and bring things up. Each community might have slightly different rules, but as a whole, they all have a very firm, consent can be revoked, etc., etc. But in between players in games, there just isn't consent without that cultural system in place.
Right. So these cultures manifest themselves into the games. The games don't create them, and these cultures come in with their own sets of rules and sets of norms and expectations for each other that most everybody follows.
Most everyone, or they get kicked from the group, and then you don't have to deal with them anymore. So yes. Right.
Well, that seems like a healthy way to handle that. Although you would expect, what's the responsibility of the developer to realize that weird stuff that we didn't anticipate is going down in our servers? Should we get involved?
Well, honestly, it's less about them getting involved and more making sure that the tools exist for the people to use, right? VR chat has things like you can block people auto-entering the area you're in, which is a very, very healthy tool for building consent around, because it means that if someone wants to join into what is an adult area, they would have to talk to someone and they would have to be informed about what it was, and that whole process would go through. They don't really need to get involved too much beyond having those tools so that people can consent and engage in that system. Whereas you have things in a lot of online communities where the biggest problem that exists is not so much that consent, but more that they don't have systems in play for age verification, which is a massive problem in the internet. And that ties into consent because of the fact that they can't, right? But because verbally they can in a message, and there's no system in play to confirm that they can consent, that causes all kinds of situations. So I think that's the most important thing. If you have a community that plays your game and there is an adult aspect of that, you need to provide them the tools for them to be safe and do things safely with others in a way that doesn't cause massive problems.
Or if you have children that frequently play your game, you need to have things in place to protect them from that kind of stuff.
Don't put them in a situation where they're being asked to provide consent to something they don't really understand.
Let's ignore the kid part for a second, because we got to go back to another episode, the kid part. And I know Andy's been wanting to have an episode on Roblox for a long time. But it really is interesting that games here have the advantage over regular situations, world situations, where consent is something that you can have a technological solution for, right? Where you can literally empower each person to to decide how much of their autonomy they want to maintain, and how much they want to let other people in. It's really amazing, as and maybe this speaks well for the future of the metaverse, that at least that's possible. What do you guys think? And maybe we could have started with this, but it's also not a bad way to end, right? What do you think games in general today tell people about intimacy? What are they communicating to people about intimacy in general?
I think they are in, as I've said before, they are in a process towards communicating better, right? I know I mentioned Witcher 3 before, but it really hit me hard how that game was approached the idea of, if you just try and match up with these characters for sex, it can go very badly. And it's not a case of, well, here's your next chance to open the communication wheel and try again. That part of the narrative was done, and it continued. And so my draw at the end was a lonely old man who didn't have a partner, but then donated all of that time to raising his daughter. And that's like a beautiful story about, intimacy didn't work out for him because he didn't know what these people wanted, but he learnt from that and used it to make a stronger family, is a lovely story that does intersect with that idea of consent and intimacy. But the queer game space especially does some very, very interesting things with that. And the whole indie scene is rife with very, very good ideas. Strangely enough, if I look at AAA games as a whole, there's less and less of them that have that really strong, intimate link. Like, the last one I can think of was probably Cyberpunk, and that was a bit of a joke in some places, where I could see the like hopes and dreams of the writers coming through, where they had spent all of this time that had just been marred by, quite frankly, a push to get the game out as fast as possible, right? But there could have been so much more there. But yeah, I feel like intimacy is something that the indie scene is doing a really good job of leading the way towards, and a lot of these people are future AAA people.
Then let's pick up on that. What are they? What's going on in the indie scene that's being done so well that could be essentially, I don't want to say universalized, because games should be different, but extended past indie games?
I think one of the things that kind of differentiates indie games and AAA games is less about like size and funding and more about risk taking. AAA games can't afford to take the risk, not because they can't afford, but because the expected return of investment is so high. So we're actually seeing a lot less but like smaller things happening in them. We're seeing a lot more of the same because it seems safe. So the indie scene, I think one of the big things I would like to see it move from indie to AAA is listen to all of your audience and pick something you want to explore. The indie scene seems to take a tiny thing that someone has said, hey, this is a cool area to explore, or this is a cool system to explore, or this is a cool game, play style that people want, and they build a game around that. So you get really cool indie games like Unpacking and, Slime Rancher and Return of the Oberdin, and I think Dredge was recently one that has come out, which is like they're smaller games and they have gotten acclaim, and then games that are taking more allegorical stances like 11-bit studios, this War of Mine or Frostpunk. These are independent games that can afford to take these kinds of risks because the return of investment isn't expected. But the reason they work is because there are people who love this thing that's happening. And I think we've been a bit doom and gloom in some parts of this, of like, why haven't games done this? I want to reinforce, we're not looking back and going, why didn't you do this? You were wrong for that. It is more people are braying, they're like begging for certain things. You can check fan fiction sites that are full of just hookup fan fictions, right? You can check reviews that say, I ship these characters together, or I wanted to spend more time with this person. If you look at even games that are a bit larger, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, there are guides on here are the people you can romance and how to hook up with them. And how to get them, that kind of stuff. There are people who desperately want intimacy, romance, not necessarily sex, but this idea of a more emotional connection with characters. They are begging for it, and when they can't get it, they make it up themselves. If AAA could look at the independent sphere and go, where are some little risks we could take to incorporate our game, and then specifically look at the reception of that, I think that expands what AAA games can do. Unfortunately, what it looks like is AAA games are now all about what is the biggest amount of money we can get for the production we are making. That is
with the lowest risk.
Issue. With the lowest risk, which is a whole other discussion to be had, because I think, and this is why I push for it so much, to me, games are unique in their ability to let players explore things they have never had a chance to explore before in a completely safe environment. Because no matter how distressing or upsetting or, confronting it is, when you turn the device off, it's gone, right? You don't have to deal with fallout. I mean, if you've been triggered, that's a whole different thing, but you don't have to deal with another person's upset. You don't have to deal with distress. You can turn it off and it's gone, it's over. And so it has been used in the past. The standout example is always Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. It has been used in the past to expose people to things they have never had to experience before, never had a chance to experience before. And I think that's just not embraced enough. And I think that is an amazingly unique and universal aspect to games. It is probably the one thing I would argue is universal, is you are experiencing something that you probably have no chance to experience any other way. Even if it's something you do experience and it's just safe, like The Sims. Hey, you're building a house, but you know the code to put in as much money as possible to build the house of your dreams, right? You can experience it in a safe way. Why do we stop when it comes to things like intimacy, romance, relationships, breakups, heartbreak, love, in a safe way that isn't like you have to look this person in the eye again, or you have to deal with the actual distress of having your heart broken? Because this is a tool of empathy that almost no other medium can do as well as games. And I think that's so valuable. And the reason I talk about this is I want to see more.
Well, I'm inspired. Let's do it.
Yeah. All right. After that, I want to ask you guys the last question that we always ask, which is, what do you want to leave our listeners with? Here's the challenge, right? It needs to be under 1 minute, because I think that's what Zia wanted to leave our listeners with.
So I think the biggest thing I'd like to leave listeners with is this idea of intimacy and consent doesn't need to be this is where it ends, this is what you have to do. These are things about exploration, and I don't think people engage with that enough. So listeners, what I suggest is go out, find some games about intimacy and consent, and explore what they mean to you and what you want out of them.
Cool.
That's great.
I think games as a medium are unique in their ability to allow people to experience things that are not their own experience. What I would love to see more from games from both the players and developers is more exploration of intimacy and romance in a way that only games can do in a safe environment that benefits actual people in their real lives, if only to let them healthily examine things that might otherwise be a bit confronting.
Nice. All right. Yeah. All right. Fae Daunt Zhia Zariko, thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
Thank you so
Woo.
much for having us.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
All right. All right. Play nice, everyone.
You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.